Dear President Lebrun, dear Minister Friedrich, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure and honor to be here today and to be given the opportunity to deliver the keynote speech on the role of regional parliaments in EU multi-level governance. First of all, let me thank the Committee of the Regions for hosting this conference. It has been a wonderful collaboration in the past few months, and my deepest thanks go also to Minister Friedrich and to the State Ministry of Baden-Württemberg for supporting today's event. So, why are we here today? It is, I believe, our shared interest in the dynamic development of the EU and what this means for the region and especially for regional parliaments and their role in EU policymaking. In the academic literature, there is a broad consensus that firstly, the process of European integration went hand in hand with dramatic changes for the role of parliaments in general. They are widely perceived as losers of European integration, and President Lebrun also pointed out to that. Secondly, the renewed interest of academics in the role of parliaments in EU affairs is very welcome, and it clearly sheds light on the process of what I would call a parliamentarization or re-parliamentarization of EU politics based on the provisions laid out in the Lisbon Treaty. However, in the literature there is a blind spot. While there is a lot of talk about emerging multi-level parliamentary system, the actual analysis remains limited to a two-level structure only. And that is the supranational level European Parliament and the 28 national parliaments. With very few exceptions, regional parliaments are almost completely ignored in this otherwise very vivid academic discussion. And this academic ignorance stands in stark contrast to the realities of regional parliaments and their role in EU affairs. As we all know, the Lisbon Treaty provides new rights and thereby new opportunities also for regional parliaments. The key provision is laid out in the subsidiarity protocol and states that, quote, it will be for each national parliament or each chamber of a national parliament to consult, where appropriate, regional parliaments with legislative powers, unquote. For that reason, a group of 74 regional parliaments from 8 member states are now recognized actors within the early warning mechanism. This system is now in place for 5 years. Thus, it is important to take stock of the effects it has had on regional parliaments in particular and on the institutional arrangement of European multi-level parliamentarism in general. The key objective of today's conference is to raise awareness on the role of these regional parliaments, of the challenges they face and how they respond to them. It is important to analyze the shortcomings of the current system, to identify the challenges and to discuss future perspectives. What I want to do in my speech is to provide you with an input regarding the following questions, and that is, why should regional parliaments play a role in EU affairs? In which way have they adapted to the new rights and opportunities? What are the key challenges and perspectives, and what can and should the Committee of the Regions do to strengthen the role of regional parliaments? Let me start with the normative question. Why should regional parliaments play a role? To some of you, at least, the answer may seem obvious, and thus the question itself may be considered bizarre. Yet I suggest to take it serious. The important point is that different answers relate to different perceptions of what the EU actually is, what is the role of the regions in the multi-level system, and what should the EU be. I will discuss this normative issue in greater detail for 2 reasons. The pragmatic reason is that we will focus on question 2 and 3 in much more detail in the workshops today. And secondly, The predominant answer given to the normative why question is that regional parliamentary involvement improves the overall democratic legitimacy in the EU. But that is, from an academic perspective, first of all, a normative claim, and normative claims require theoretical and also empirical verification. In addition, this assessment depends on very specific theoretical assumptions, and the question may be answered at the political level, and for example, by political actors as a Committee of the Regions, yet the academic answer is not so obvious, and it's still preliminary. Given the overall neglect of regional parliaments in the literature, it comes as no surprise that we can hardly find any answers in the academic literature. There is a body of literature on the effects of European integration on territorial state-regional relations in the member states, but this literature focuses on governments. It's not interested in parliaments. And while there is, on the other hand, a growing literature on the parliamentary dimension of the EU, this does not include the regional level. It remains silent. So in the light of this enormous research gap, and with generous support from the Foster Europe Foundation for Strong European Regions, I organized a conference in fall 2012 that looked particularly in the role of regional parliaments. And one of the key questions we asked our presenters at the conference was to give their views on the issue of why should they play a role. Let me give you 3 examples of answers that we got. The first one is by Ben Krum, a Dutch colleague and a great supporter of the development of what he calls a multi-level parliamentary field. And Ben Krum argues that mere logic of the more the merrier does not hold, meaning that, quote, there is no point in the wholesale extension of the EU multi-level parliamentary field to include all EU regional parliaments. Krum argues that at best only those regional parliaments should be included that fulfill 2 conditions. And the first condition is an institutional one. He argues that, quote, it basically concerns a situation where regions enjoy so much autonomy and distinctiveness that their interests are unlikely to be adequately reflected in the national parliament. The second condition is more fundamental, and it's a sociological one. Krum suggests that the question whether regional parliaments should have direct access to EU decision-making independently from their national parliaments hinges on the demos test. And this is, are the citizens of the region full and equal participants in the process of collective will formation that takes place at the national level, or is the regional process of collective will formation effectively detached from that at the national level? And based on these 2 criteria, Krum argues that only a small number of these 47 regional parliaments actually fulfill these criteria. That is, some regional parliaments in Belgium, in Spain, and in the devolved parts in the UK. In short, that is the parliaments of Flanders, Wallonia, Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Scotland. The German Länder, even though they enjoy a state-like quality according to the German constitution, do not stand the test, nor do the Austrian or Italian parliaments, even though South Tyrol may be a critical case in terms of the demos test. Werner Patzelt, a German expert on parliaments, emphasizes great skepticism more from a constitutional engineering perspective. He claims that it was a deliberate choice that the involvement of regional parliaments depend both on quite different national traditions of respect for national assemblies, and that regional parliaments should have at best only indirect influence and suspensive veto powers. He argues that the rational and ex-ante anticipation of their concerns is limited and has to be limited, that regional parliaments simply lack the required resources for meaningful participation, that there is a structural lack of incentives for regional parliaments to become active, and a lack of interparliamentary cooperation. So, Patzelt comes to a very pessimistic conclusion. Quote, if we want to combine European federalism with parliamentary democracy, then we must guarantee an enduring strong influence of national parliaments on EU policy making. Secondly, we better accept that there is neither an effective European role for subnational parliaments nor any chance for them to contribute to the EU's democratic legitimacy. Unquote. Nevertheless, Patzelt highlights that regional parliaments remain important, but only at regional level, certainly not at EU level. So while I do clearly see the problem that these colleagues call attention to, I'm, however, not totally convinced by their arguments. One argument they neglect is, for example, the size of population, something that Minister Friedrich also drew attention to, because a number of regions are much bigger in terms of population than several of the small member states. And the question is, should this have any implications on representation at EU level? Furthermore, researchers often have, as Patzelt, the German Länder in mind and do not consider differences between the EU member states and EU regions, and these are, of course, severe. Research on federalism, therefore, provides us with some good arguments by pointing out that it is important to investigate the interdependencies between specific types of democracy and specific types of federalism. Along these lines, experts on federalism, just as Sabine Kropp, who's here with us today, she argues that certain types of federalism match up just specific forms of democracy. And what's more, that subnational parliaments are better able to fulfill basic parliamentary functions if parliamentary democracy is combined with a federal system that is based on voluntary cooperation. Asymmetries with regards to powers and resources may negatively impact upon the willingness to cooperate. This, I think, provides us with more precise arguments pertaining to the role of regional parliaments within their federal or devolved member states and within the EU system at large. In general, in multi-level systems, parliaments are in a weaker position vis-à-vis the executive branch, as Kropp emphasizes. The EU is a very particular form of a federalized non-state polity. It is a cooperative federalized system that builds not on voluntary but on constitutionally enforced negotiations with some clear veto points. And this always privileges executives and leaves Parliament in a difficult situation. Therefore, the problem arises for parliaments: how can they control their governments and thereby try to shape EU policy making? But this is a systemic problem for parliaments not only at regional level but also for the national parliaments. To sum up, different theoretical viewpoints can provide us with very different responses as to the role of regional parliaments, their desirability in EU affairs, and the limits of their involvement. There is until now not an obvious and final answer, and that means it always brings about the need for more empirical research. And this takes me to the second question. In which ways have regional parliaments adapted to the new rights and opportunities? Based on studies commissioned by the Committee of the Region and on a limited body of academic literature, there is at least sufficient empirical evidence to proclaim that regional parliaments with legislative powers have reacted to the new institutional opportunities, even though the Lisbon Treaty is not the beginning of the reform processes. The authors of the COR, of the Committee of the Regions study, confirm that, quote, there has been a clear trend towards stronger involvement in the EU legislative process. Most of these regional parliaments have indeed integrated specific procedures for subsidiarity monitoring in their internal rules. However, the involvement in the early warning system and the procedures for conducting subsidiarity scrutiny differ widely from one parliament to another and from one member state to another, unquote. I cannot go into the details of the reforms, so I will sketch out some general findings. What we see is that regional parliaments have implemented the new Lisbon-related rights via very different mechanisms and rules. The majority of them has introduced European affairs committees which are involved in subsidiarity checks, but the power of these committees and their relations to other parliamentary committees differ. Many of them have limited administrative staff that is concerned with subsidiarity monitoring. Notwithstanding, there is a strong dependence on governmental expertise and information and assistance. Regional parliaments are more and more inclined to deliberate earlier on, particularly on Commission's annual legislative program, in order to be prepared more early in the policy process. A number of regional parliaments has installed liaison offices in Brussels, but usually understaffed. Many participate in the Committee of the Region subsidiarity networks. RegPax is today a well-known but not always intensely used instrument for the exchange of information. More than half of the regional parliaments are members. And I could continue, but I want to stop here and leave further details to today's workshop, so I will have the chance to exchange your views and experiences. What is, however, apparent is that regional parliaments clearly try to adapt to the new environment of Europeanized policymaking. Yet the picture is uneven. There are winners and there are losers. And the question of resources becomes important, and this takes me to my third question. What are key challenges and perspectives? There are a number of them. Some have to do with institutional structures in the EU member states. Obviously, the institutional environment for regional parliament differs between the 8 EU member states. It does make, of course, a difference if there is only one regional parliament with legislative powers in an otherwise unitary member state, as is the case with the Åland Island in Finland, or if there are numerous regional parliaments in a fully fledged federal system, as you would find in Germany, Belgium, and Austria, or if there is a regional parliament with different degrees of sovereignty in a regionalized system, as we do see in Spain more or less, but also in the UK. It does make a difference if there is a second chamber at national level with close links to the regional level, like the German Bundesrat is in a very particular situation. Empirical studies illustrate that the relations between regional parliaments and their national counterparts varies greatly. That matters because it's obvious that subsidiarity decisions are usually not communicated directly to the EU, but they are collected at national level, and they are not sent forward to EU institutions. Until now, we do not even have any data as to how many reasoned opinions, for example, have been issued by regional parliaments in the past 5 years, if these opinions have been taken up at national level and what happened to them. There is no system of documentation for that. A second point is that the early warning system itself provides some limits. The overall limitations inherent in the system lead to very uneven participation. While some regional parliaments are fairly active, others are not. Most prominently, the 8-week time limit is a real challenge for all regional parliaments because they also have to interact with their national counterparts during this short time. But some can cope with this challenge more easily than others. In addition, there are very different interpretations of what subsidiarity and proportionality actually entails. It makes a difference if you have a more political or a more legalistic interpretation of what counts as a relevant ground for issuing a reasoned opinion, for example. Overall, subsidiarity control requires effective mechanisms of exchange and cooperation. Parliaments have to develop a new role, and that is a role of networkers, and that's difficult. For regional parliaments in particular, the German Länder have, for example, some established mechanisms, but also in Spain and in Belgium, in Austria also, there is more interstate cooperation these days. But it's more difficult if, like in Belgium or Spain, ethnic cleavages do play still a role. Cooperation and scrutiny provisions require resources, and that's a third key challenge. We already experience that national parliaments have difficulties coping with Europeanized policy making, and they deal with it in very different ways. Regional parliaments are, so to speak, the little and poorer sisters. Many of them cannot afford to increase administrative staff for EU scrutiny, yet this would be a requirement for making effective use of the system. Regional parliaments often depend on the information and expertise provided to them by their governments or even on governmental assistance. This makes them dependent on government. In order to have access to information from independent sources, a liaison office in Brussels may help also to employ more parliamentary staff and the like, but all this requires money. Just a few words on perspective. I believe that interparliamentary cooperation is most important also for regional parliaments, and we do see more examples of that. But I would agree with Minister Friedrich that this cannot be a substitute for parliamentary legitimation. Cooperation saves some resources, but first of all, it is a cost and time-intensive instrument. There are a number of instruments like new media, web-based tools, rec packs, and all that is helpful, but providing fora for the exchange of information and practices for training, this is all still very important. Here again, the Committee of the Region does and can play a role. Secondly, what we have to do, I think, is to overcome the control fix that is inherent in the early warning system and to continue to develop instruments for more proactive and more positive legislative politics and as part of the Commission's political dialogue with parliaments. So, finally, what can and should the Committee of the Regions do to strengthen the role? The Committee of the Regions is clearly a natural ally, so to speak, of regional parliaments. It has already provided a lot of support, rec packs, subsidiarity network, regular meetings, conferences like this, studies, etc. The revision of previous activities and its shortcomings and the 2012 new subsidiarity strategy need to be mentioned as well. A 2013 study commissioned by the Committee of the Region analyzes a number of problems in detail. So there's no need for me to report on that here in detail. But first of all, I think the Committee of the Region should continue with its awareness-raising activities and to make the regional dimension more visible to other EU and EU-related actors. The call from various sides to extend the time span as part of the early warning mechanisms for up to 12 weeks, that's, I think, an important, very concrete recommendation that should be put forward by the Committee of the Region. The dependence of regional parliaments on the national level's institution is problematic. So I think the Committee of the Region should lobby for a system that is at least documenting recent opinions issued by national parliaments. RegPacs in that respect does have its limitations. I think there should be a more clear separation in terms of governmental and parliamentary positions and opinions. There should be a system in place that further reforms entail a provision that recent opinions by regional parliaments have to be forwarded to EU institutions and have to be documented in national parliamentary positions, because this is so far not the case. Language barriers are still a major problem for cooperation. Also with RegPacs, I know that there is the shorter New English form for a simplified information exchange, but I think it's not yet as strongly promoted and as strongly and widely used as is desirable. In addition, political dialogue with the Commission and regional parliament, that's still in its infancy and it should be supported. National parliaments have the advantage that they sort of snuggle up in the European Parliament's unit for relations with national parliaments, and I think it could be an idea that the Committee of the Region should think of a similar, less cost-intensive forum for having more daily exchange between the regional parliaments. Finally, this Committee of the Region has to continue developing its ambitions as a lobbyist for regional interest. It has to stay responsive to the manifold needs of the regions in Europe. In this regard, suggestions proposed in the resolution for the new legislative period are welcome. That is, like the request for a territorial impact assessment in addition to what is called the Regional Regulatory Fitness and Performance Program, REFIT. But for it to be successful, it will be very, very difficult to implement, because all cross-cutting policy instruments are always difficult, and given the diversity of regions in the EU. To conclude, I am convinced that regional parliaments can make a valuable contribution to European governance. And enormous progress has been made in the first 5 years of the Lisbon Treaty, yet there are still many, many problems that need to be tackled, and I suggest that we talk about them not only today. So thank you very much for your attention.